So then, we are back with more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find in the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Israelic lineage. So then, we can understand the time of the end as per Yeshayahu the prophet. We find layers of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste for many centuries. As we read then Yeshayahu the 61st chapter, we understand why then the Savior was in the temple, and he was reading a section of the 61st chapter. And understandably back then there were no chapters or verses, but there were then the contents of the instructions of Yeshayahu. He did read the first section related with the completion of the spring feast, found then for us, 61st chapter. Then he did not read the second portion of the 61st because it was related with the autumn feast. However, let's try to understand then the holy instructions and the holy language of Hebrew. We find the Hebrew language holy. We find the words very true. Let's then read from a section of Daniel the prophet. We find then the 10th chapter, and then Daniel was during his service for the king, and he served under many kings, but the holy instructions shows us an area of service related with Daniel. Explains then during the time of the 3rd year of the king, and explains then King Cyrus, explains of Persia, explains of the Greco country. However, let's try to understand what then the 10th chapter and the 11th chapter and the 12th chapter mean. The 10th chapter is primarily related with the prayer and fasting of Daniel related with China. We are then reading a section of the statue of the 2nd chapter and the base of the statue, where then nations are then described as some of them strong, some of them weak. The language of Daniel is related primarily with trade. As trade is then explained, some nations would be trading strongly, some of the nations would be trading then weakly. It doesn't explain the strength of the armies, simply explaining then the day-to-day work of Daniel, doing trade for the kingdom. And he did understand then some of these nations related with the iron and clay, some of them would be strong, some of them would be weak. Very simple. Let's then understand what it means when then Daniel was fasting. He was searching. He did receive the understanding of the head of gold, being the king of Babylon, and then the chest. Then we understand the Middle Persians. Then we understand later other kingdoms would come. However, when we read Daniel, we do understand the head of gold and then the chest of silver. But then the Greco country is not in the language of Daniel because it was further ahead. Daniel, however, did understand an area where then these kingdoms would come from, and he explained as areas where then these kingdoms would then arise. Let's then understand these and enlighten ourselves related with the 11th chapter. Explains then Persia, and explains then the Mede, explains also the Greco country. None of these countries are involved with this. But let's understand the Hebrew word then prevailing over. It's not speaking of a ruler of these areas related with Daniel. Explains these earlier. Second chapter explains the entire statute. We are entering then the 10th chapter related with China. Then, during the time when Daniel was receiving these instructions from heaven, he was fighting in spirit with these areas because they were aware of the influence of these in the future. How can you explain these in an easier way? Firstly then, 10th chapter. You read, in the 30th year of Cyrus the king of Persia, a situation was revealed to Daniel, and his name was Belteshazzar. And there was a conflict, and then he was involved with a vision. However, Daniel was then in a position where he knew there was more to be discovered, but he couldn't get the information very easily. So then he fasted. For more than 20 days he was fasting. Then he received these understandings. Then you find in the 11th chapter, and then shalt be the first, second, and third kings, and there is a remnant of the fourth kingdom related then with the 2nd chapter of Daniel, the legs of iron. Then as we read these understandings, you find as Daniel was praying, he was fasting, he had to be ruling over those spirits of those places, so then he could rule and write and then have them understand. So we are not speaking of the Persians ruling in the 11th chapter of Daniel. We are not speaking of the Greco country ruling during the time of the 11th chapter, because the 11th chapter is solely related with the time of the restoration period. That's where we are at. So then, as Daniel was ruling over, he was prevailing over. Understandably, a person given a high status and working for the state, not much can be then, how can I say this in a way that's very simple? You can't hide very much when you are in a higher position. Either you are clean and you do cleanly, or you are dirty and do dirty. Daniel was clean, so he couldn't hide any information during those times. However, because Daniel was from the Hebraic lineage, many times those kings had a higher respect for Daniel. Though he was speaking words that during the time Darius, for instance, would never understand, yet in his spirit he did know there were areas related, for instance, with the Greco people, because the word used for these you find in the 3rd verse of the 11th chapter is the word lexicon 3120. However, the Holy Hebrew only explains the area from where this kingdom would come from. It doesn't explain as the Greco nation. This was translated later because they knew then the influence of the place. However, what Daniel was doing, he was prevailing over the spirit of that area during his time. So also as the Persians. Those were strong spirits of the time, and he was prevailing over them. So he could deliver these information in his recordings. What can we understand of the 11th chapter? Firstly then, chapter 10 is related with China, the leader of the base of the statue, as far as trade, because Daniel was a tradesperson. The 11th chapter explains the relationship with the kingdom of the east, north, and south. The 12th chapter, however, explains the information of China partially, section of the east, north, and south, and then the closing of the age. As we understand, later on came the rock and destroyed every nation. These, however, as we read, we obviously understand the translator of these holy instructions was then mistaken. It's not truly the kingdom of Persia related with these first, second, and third kingdoms, because these are gone. We are reading from 2nd chapter of Daniel, then the explanation of each of those parts of the statue. Later on until the 10th, you find they are already passed. So then you can't go back during the time of the restoration period and read those same areas that was then explained before. Doesn't make any sense. But you do find when Daniel was praying and he was fasting, he was prevailing over those areas explained in Hebrew. An area over there from those sections shall rise a kingdom from those areas. So he was prevailing over them, so as he was prevailing over the kingdom of Persia, until he delivered the information, so then they were aware of it. The 11th chapter is simply the relationship with the kingdom of the north, east, and then south. Namely then the kingdom of the north, Soviet Union, kingdom of the east, China, and south, then Africa. This is what we have. Back then, Daniel would never, under any condition, would give these areas as then Africa, Soviet Union, and then China. But the Hebrew word, the original word, you can find. The word used in Hebrew was related with the east, one of them north, and the other south. So then, what can we understand of the translations? The Hebrew words are true. The problem is times and seasons, generation upon generation upon generation. As they read, translators, they try to make sense when they read. They can't understand sometimes when they read, and they want to understand what they write. So then they begin to have some similitudes from chapter to chapter. The problem is when they are not grounded as far as the holy feasts, when they don't understand the principles of Leviticus, the 23rd chapter. Then they try on their own, making similitudes in relations with times and seasons where they don't match. Daniel was prevailing over those places in the spirit as he was searching for the answer. The 11th chapter is simply the relationship of those kingdoms, first, second, and third. And then there is a remnant of the fourth kingdom previously spoken, where you find then the false savior of Rome. They concocted their own savior, because then later is linked with the despised one, and then despised one with the covenant. So then, as we understand this line of understanding, what can we conclude of this important information? It's very simple. What are we expecting today from the nations and what they are doing? What is the despised one trying to do? United States is then the second beast of Revelation. Why beast? Because during the time of the 1,000 years of deceit, you find only a couple of nations truly ruling the world. You find Great Britain and you find United States. These are then completed as 1,000 years. During the time when the Great Britain lost the New Albion, or then the Northern America, or North America, you find then a breakaway of Great Britain. Then you find during this time United States trying to hold on to those junkies 1,000 years of deceit. Then what can we expect of the Middle East? Very simple. The Holy Instructions are explaining that those areas such as Egypt, such as Syria, such as Iran, Iraq, those areas must be joined in trade, as they were linked for thousands of years. The problem is the Western influence is then obviously destroying their way of living. Let's make this very simple yet. United States is a very young nation, roughly over a couple of 100 years old. Some of those places in Iran, Iraq, Syria, Libya, those places are more than 1,000 years, easily more than 1,000 years. And China then is one of the oldest. Now let me ask you this. For 800 years Great Britain had done its share, but then they couldn't hold. Do you think the US is going to hold, being the youngest of them both? No, they won't. In fact, the US is breaking very fastly. So then, as we understand the second beast, or the US, or then the couple of 100 years then that these leadership was given, there is an area of the Holy Instructions explaining a prevailing over the United States and restoring trade amongst those eastern countries. As far as the war going on in Iraq, should the nations be involved? Not regarding destruction and war. They should not be involved. They should be wise. They should consult with those groups related with the humanitarian forces and then understand how they should act. The United States already made a big mistake during the Gulf War, and they had dragged then Great Britain until they couldn't hold anymore. Later on, both nations were ashamed because they should have taken the time until action was taking place. And the US is trying to extend and extend and extend, and they're trying to drag other nations into their own troubles. What can we conclude of these? Let's read then the despised one. You find very simply in the 21st verse of the 11th chapter, and then speaks of a combat, not in anger, not in combat, but it shall stand in his place a despised one. That's what we understand then USA being rejected as this younger country trying to hold to its own purposes and culture. Ezekiel 37th chapter explains very simply the stick of authority of the first son, Ishmael, related with the trade. The second son relates with tabernacling being established. We understand from these the covenant as then the standing of the vision the coming and returning of the holy cities. Now let me ask you this. You find the Eastern culture, you find the Hebrews understanding their own writings, you find then nations, the Arab nations, for thousands of years, during an area of the world where then they ruled. And then later on you find a younger country on the other side of the world, not related with Ibrahim, not related with those patriarchs, then ruling the world. Let me ask you this, do you think they're going to stand for a very long time? It even ridiculous comparing with it. Under any condition, the Arab nations coming from Ibrahim are going to then to stand down before the United States. Never. Under any condition, they won't do it. Western culture mostly is dirty. Dirty in religion, dirty in relationship, dirty in every way you can think of. It's simply money, riches, people being disposable, wars. So the U.S. is becoming the despised one because they're trying to extend themselves beyond the time where they should have. However, you find that a very fine path, a very tiny path, is extended because must reach the despised status. Now let me ask you this. Since we know the path coming in the future, as far as the Westerners, mostly United States, should other countries join up with them in war? If you do, you are stupid. We get explaining during the time of the Restoration period, where then you find even the Gentiles were included in the plan. Time of restoration, time of peace, a time of understanding. You're not going to achieve understanding if you force destruction. Let's then make an evaluation as far as those militants then in northern part of Iraq. Those are from Islam, and they understand and they enjoy their religion status. However, must have some sort of plan of including these people in a new system of trade. Most of the Islamic people are from the traders and caravans of the time of Ishmael, liking it or not. They come from Ishmael, the first son of Ibrahim. And China is rescuing this trusting trade. The new system is showing itself very strong. But let's then evaluate what the United States then is provoking as far as what's going on in the Soviet Union. They are having many sanctions, but then the Soviets should not be concerned with it. If the Soviets decide they should not import any more meat or grain from the US, so be it. South America is readily available for the helping of the Soviet Union. They can get whatsoever they want. In South America, you'll find grain, you'll find meat of many kinds. But what should be taking place then? Precisely as it was explained in the Holy Instructions. You find in the Kingdom of the North ruling as far as a military stands. You find then that every understanding of the Northern Kingdom shall to be completed. He shall do as he wilt. As long as the path chosen is then related with the Gentile Netzer, Amazingly, China won't release any atomic bomb, neither the Soviet Union. Isn't that strange? People are more afraid of the socialists releasing bombs than otherwise. And the very people they think they should be trusted are the very people that are going to release the bombs. Gog and Magog, United States and Israel. Should say the disobedient Israel. And the rebels as people of USA. These must release those bombs. There are a couple of them. Read Zechariah. The galals. Galal simply is a tube. From the plural couple of galals, one of them 10, the other 20. Is explaining then, when you read the 8th chapter of Revelation, Yohanan saw then these galal coming from heaven as a star coming down and then making a pit in the ground. One of them was in Arabia because the mountain was burning of petroleum. As you understand how then the oceans are going to be destroyed, at least a third part of it, and the other on dry land. The United States releasing a bomb on China. And amazingly, China won't release any bombs on anybody, neither the Soviets. Isn't that amazing? So then, from this perspective, what should be our stance as far as many nations that adopted the monetary system of the United States? They should be very concerned with it, because as the Gentile netzer, let's read then from a section where we find this 7th verse of the 11th chapter. The word is 534:2, word regarding netzer, explaining then the socialists then coming back for the protection of trade. Why then are these people returning, as we understand back in the 60s, where the United States murdered their own president? You know, that situation regarding then President John, he was murdered by the military of United States. What a miserable shame. The situation over there in the state of Texas, and then regarding then the private over there that was involved with the murdering of the president, he didn't do it. Amazingly, he didn't do it. But then the sniper was not in the top or then in the library in any point. He was then in the exit of the sewer, where then the rainwater drains from, the road. There was a man over there. He had his gun pointing at the head of the president from there. Why then they destroyed President John? Because John did not murder then Mr. Castro from Cuba. Back then the Soviets were very much friends with the Cubans, and the US was involved in a very strong and very dangerous game. John did not want to murder Castro. Then the US politicians were angry at him and they destroyed John. That's what they did. If they admit or not, that's their problem, but we know the truth. Then as these socialists, they are then gathering themselves regarding then obviously China, Soviet Union, regarding Cuba must be reunited, regarding then Congo, finishing up what Che Guevara started, and then removing the sanctions from Cuba. Cuba has a big port. And then establishing the new trade system, mostly led by China. China's economy is absolutely in the very top. They have a very strong economy, and they will to rule. Then later on we come to the second transition, where then the Arabs, very wisely, they will join the BRICS, and providing then fuel for those traders, mostly then the transportation system, and then providing them with the fuel, so then the restoration of the stick of authority of the first son is done then in trustworthy way, and they obviously trust each other, and not only this, they understand the importance of the holy instructions in the first son. Later on, then the Arabs will to become a great partner regarding this new trade system. Thus then the second transition. By this time, then we can understand the kingdom of the south becoming strong is when then China makes a deal with the Congo because of technology and the rare materials. And then we understand the finishing up of the work of Che Guevara in Congo. That's why it's important. We are linking up then China, Cuba, and then the Gentile Netzer of the 7th verse of the 11th chapter. So then, later on, I'm going to study then the covenant. And what is the relationship of the despised one with the fourth kingdom? You read then in the first section of the 11th chapter, those first, second, and third kings, and then you find the fourth, reminiscences of the fourth kingdom. And what these means as far as the false savior. We will explore then the first covenant, or the first service and its re-establishment. You understand then the false ruler of this covenant, and then we will study also the establishment of the vision, explaining then tabernacling. So please stay tuned, much more coming up.